mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and the UN General Assembly designated January 27th as a time to remember the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and the millions of other victims of Nazi persecution. Dr. Dan McMillan is the author of How Could This Happen? Explaining the Holocaust, and he joins us now live to talk more about all of this. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you for having me, Josh.
Of course. Well, first off, can you kind of explain to me the basis behind International Holocaust Remembrance Day? We went over some of the basics, but how was this created and what is it there to do?
Well, it commemorates the day in 1945 when the Red Army liberated the Auschwitz death camp, and it was created partly as a way of remembering and doing honor to the many victims, and also in the hopes of furthering the cause of Holocaust education, so that we can, learn from this disaster for all kinds of ways that we can improve, and of course, so to prevent such a genocide from happening again. So genocide obviously still continues, and we'll probably see more of it, particularly in the overpopulated, sort of under-resourced parts of the world in the decades ahead. But on the other hand, I do think that we in our country, in Germany and other, what we call the first world countries, have in fact learned from the lessons of the Nazi era and the Holocaust in a very purposeful way. And we've made tremendous moral progress. I don't, for example, think that another genocide, it's hard to imagine it being possible, say, in our country, in Germany, Canada, any of these other first world societies, whereas 80 years ago, Germany was in many respects the most advanced human society, certainly the most literate, most educated, that did this. And that's, I guess, one way of marking the moral progress of humankind.
And on that same note, why is a day like this so important for people to pay attention to not celebrate, but observe?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think, to me, the most important lessons are, first of all, that the value that we place on human life is something that we have to affirm and kind of constantly defend and not take for granted, because what's distinctive about the Holocaust, in my view, what really makes the Holocaust and makes it unique and uniquely horrifying among all mass killings in history, is that this is the one moment in history where human life, in the eyes of the perpetrators, lost all value whatsoever. The Nazis' denial of the value of human life is most extreme with regard to the Jewish victims, whom they hoped to ideally eradicate completely. They saw the Jewish people as a virus that they wanted to stamp out everywhere, but was also true of 6 or 7 million Gentile victims, people who, for example, 200,000 German mental patients that they killed just to save money so they wouldn't have to take care of them. And I think that, so what's really I want people most to understand about the Holocaust is this is really the moment when the ruling class of an advanced society decided that an individual life had no value whatsoever, that if it served the larger purpose of strengthening Germany, then your life was forfeit. That if we asked those killers, why are you doing this? They probably would have said to us, why not? They're just people. So that's one point that I've taken a little too long to make. I think the other point that I think is very fascinating about the Holocaust is it shows the power of ideas and circumstances to change our behavior, because the people who did this, we're not talking about a clique of misfits. We're talking about 200,000 German and Austrian men and a couple of thousand women, among the most successful and educated members of that society. But and those people psychologically, emotionally did not differ from you and me by one iota, at least not until they became murderers. And so it shows that human beings, I don't think that we are naturally bad. I think actually our default setting is kindness, but we lack a strong moral compass. And if you put us in the wrong circumstances and teach us the wrong ideas, there's no limit to how low we can sink. And that's also something to understand about human beings and human societies.
What inspired you to write a book about the Holocaust?
I read Simon Wiesenthal's The Murderers Among Us, which is a memoir of his own survival of the Holocaust and the careers of some of the top perpetrators he had helped bring to justice. I read this 51 years ago in early 1973 when I was 12 years old, and it just knocked me flat. And a need to understand it is part of why I chose German as my second foreign language in high school, majored in German in college, and chose to get my doctorate in German history when I wanted to become an historian. What was so compelling about it, again, I think what struck me the most was just the extraordinary coldness, the emotional indifference of the killers toward their victims. You know, every other mass killing I know of, you know, was done kind of in hot blood and out of fear of the victims, whereas the Germans who killed the Jews did less so because they felt they had to, more because they wanted to, because they saw it as an opportunity they didn't want to pass up. And the emotional state in which they did this was not a hot, passionate hatred. It was an indifference so cold that it evoked no emotion stronger than the disgust you feel when stepping on a cockroach in your kitchen. And I guess it's that coldness, that indifference to human life, which to me is somehow even more horrifying, more disturbing even than hatred. That's how the Holocaust got its hooks into me when I was 12 years old, and it's never let go of me since.
How does, and this is a tough question to answer, I'm sure, but how does the Holocaust still have an influence on the world today, all of these decades later?
Well, you know, I think there's an enormously positive influence. I think it's a constant reminder for us to defend, to try our best to strengthen government by the people, the democratic form of government, because that is the strongest and most important barrier to every kind of oppression. Not to mention the fact that it's the only kind of government that works. And we ourselves in America should be cognizant of that, since we invented it after all. I think that, but in a way that there is also kind of a negative aspect that I always try to combat. I think that many people take the Holocaust as a reason for pessimism about human nature, to say things like, well, we've evolved so much technologically, made all this material progress, but morally we're still in the Stone Age or worse, and that is simply not true. I think we need to remember that the Holocaust is not the only thing we did in history, that kind of behavior is very much the exception rather than the rule, and also that we really have done so much to learn from it. And in particular, you see this very dramatically in the case of Germany, the perpetrator nation, because they made Holocaust education and commemoration a central part of their civic culture starting at the beginning of the 1980s. No country, I think, has faced up to the dark side of its history more bravely, more sincerely, than have the Germans. And the consequence of that is that I think that democratic norms may be more strongly felt, more deeply rooted in Germany than I think in any other wealthy country that I know of, that I've studied. And it's really quite impressive, and it's, for me, a very inspiring example of how human societies can progress. Because 80 years ago, the Germans were a nightmare for all of humankind, and today Germany is, for all its faults, is in many ways a kind of model society that is very decent, where people have a very good life and people treat each other on balance quite well, and where the democratic form of government is very strong. So I guess, I don't want to be, what I would want to say, one of the most important conclusions of my book is that it took an almost perfect storm of many different factors to make this possible. For this to happen in our most advanced society, it wasn't enough for one thing to go wrong or two or three. It took like a dozen things that had to go wrong. And therefore, the Holocaust stands as a warning that we must always keep in mind of the importance of affirming the value of human life. But on the other hand, it is not, in my view, a sound reason for pessimism about the future of humanity. And after all, if we are going to make a better world, and here at home, if we're going to make an America where everyone belongs, we have to have some faith in ourselves, in our capacity for goodness and progress. And I think if you can, how shall I put it, if you can understand the Holocaust and nonetheless retain your faith in human goodness, which I have, that's what it's done for me, then you really know that human beings are capable of all kinds of great things.
All right. Dr. Dan McMillan, thank you so much for taking the time to share your thoughts, your feelings, and more about your book here as we are going to celebrate or observe International Holocaust Remembrance Day tomorrow. Is there anything else you want to add before I let you go?
You know, I guess a final thing I would say is that, you know, people often sort of want to talk about the Holocaust as a way of, you know, teaching tolerance and preventing prejudice. I think in some ways it's probably, I think it's essential to understand as a way of understanding. It's just of such great and important, compelling importance. I think if I wanted to, when I think about how to teach people to be more tolerant, how to overcome prejudice, I think the one thing I'd really love to see is that we do a better job in our schools of teaching foreign languages, because I think learning a language is a really great way, I found this from my own experience, of developing empathy for people who come from a very different cultural background than your own. It helps you look at the world through their eyes. And that's, I guess, one other thing. I mean, I want to see more Holocaust education in our country. I'd also like to see more language learning.
All right. Dr. Dan McMillan, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. And I know you'll be back tomorrow as we do observe International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Thank you again for taking the time to be here with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Josh.
And don't forget